What was that? Ja, pass auf, wir machen Folgendes. Uns beide.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Distinguished guests, I am both honored and delighted to warmly welcome you to the opening ceremony of the 23rd International Congress of Historical Sciences, Poznań 2020-2022. The International Committee of Historical Sciences, as you know, it is the association of historians from all over the world, and its main task is to organize every 5 years the International Congresses of Historical Sciences all over the world, in various parts of the world. So far, in Poland, it was held only once. It was in 1933 in Warsaw, in our capital. And now, today, we are in Poznań. We are here. I warmly welcome you in this beautiful concert hall of Adam Mickiewicz University. And please let me invite on the stage our host, the host of this place, Professor Bogumiła Kaniewska, Director of Adam Mickiewicz University.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear participants of the 23rd International Congress of Historical Sciences, it's a great day for Poznań, it's a great day for the University of Adam Mickiewicz, and for me personally to welcome you finally in Poznań and at our university. Welcome to Poland and to one of the oldest Polish cities, a former capital of the country. I extend my words of welcome to Congress participants gathered here in this beautiful hall, and also to online participants making use of the internet. I welcome you to the city in which the first rulers of Poland are buried. According to the most recent historical research on the beginnings of Polish statehood, conducted by our university academics supervised by Professor Koćka-Kręc, the baptism of the first Polish ruler, Prince Mieszko I, was held in Poznań, and in the nearby Gniezno Cathedral, the first ceremonies of crowning Polish kings were held. In short, welcome to a historical region marking the beginning of Polish statehood. The leading motive of the Congress, Quo Vadis Historiae, is timeless. There have been many attempts to answer this question. Cicero concluded that historia testis temporum, lux veritatis, vita memoriae, magistra vitae. But a good question is whether our past experience teaches us anything. This question makes sense in the context of the brutal war conducted by the Russian Federation just across the Polish eastern border. Unfortunately, military confrontation have always been an integral part of the history of humanity. Could this world exist without wars? Last year, the world's military expenditures exceeded the amount of $2 trillion. I believe this question and issues will be discussed by Congress participants. The Congress, as Magister Ewa Kolanus said, is held for the second time in Poland, now in Poznań, but the 7th Congress was organized in Warsaw back in the historical year 1933. This Congress was organized in the capital of our country, not long after Poland had regained its independence. Today, we are in Poznań, the capital of Wielkopolska region. I'm very happy that my city, along with the Adam Mickiewicz University, whose rector I'm honored to be, shall serve for a few days as the world capital of historical science experts. The Congress is opening today, but preparation to the Congress started already 7 years ago. At that time, we were not aware how the world would change in the upcoming time. Nobody expected the outbreak of the war in Ukraine and other confrontation, such as the Azerbaijani-Armenian conflict. Neither have we expected the development of the Syrian refugee crisis and the COVID pandemic, which has paralyzed the world. COVID-19 has changed societies, customs, and dates of many events, including the date of the Congress, which originally was supposed to have taken place in 2020. Due to these disturbances, the number of Congress participants decreased. Fortunately, those participants who could not come to Poznań may attend the Congress online. As it has been mentioned, our customs have recently changed as the pandemic forced us to adjust to the ever-changing world and to make use of the availability of new technologies more efficiently. In your universities and various institutions, life was moved to the internet. Thanks to new communication technologies, we can now communicate from any location in the world. As I speak, several hundred participants are connected with us. Let me take this opportunity to extend my thanks to all those who have contributed to the organization of the Congress. I know it was not easy, but you managed, and the dream of Adam Mickiewicz University, Poznań professors, and the dream of the members of the organizing committee, especially Professor Tomasz Schramm and Professor Krzysztof Makowski, came true. By the way, I learned that they have been dreaming about the Congress in Poznań since 1970s. So now it's coming true. We only didn't expect the big modernization works which are held in Poznań now, but I hope that maybe you will like our city so much that you will come back here after the modernization will be finished. I'm not the one who is going to declare when it will be, but we have someone who surely will explain it to us. I will not show the person. So it's thanks to them, as well as thanks to the support from the authorities of the city of Poznań, the Poznań International Fair, the Committee of Historical Science of the Polish Academy of Science, our Ministry of Education and Science, Ministry of Culture and National Heritage, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as well, as thanks to many other sponsors and partners that we are meeting today in Poznań. I thank members of the organizing committee for their work and extend my gratitude to the International Committee of Historical Sciences for their trust to organize the Congress at Adam Mickiewicz University. My thanks also go to over 50 volunteers who have been assisting the Congress Organization Committee in preparatory work and shall be assisting you throughout the Congress. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you will remember your staying in Poznań and Adam Mickiewicz University as a great pleasure and a great intellectual adventure. For us, it's a great honor to have you at our university, which is one of the European universities and one of excellence universities in Poland, which is 103 years old, which for some of you is not so much, for some other quite a big, an old age, let's say. It depends on what university, what institution you are coming from to us. I wish all of you a very successful Congress, and I hope you find an answer to the major question mentioned at the beginning of my remarks. I do hope your answer is more optimistic than what Hegel said in his lectures on the philosophy of history. He said, "What experience and history teach is this, that nations and governments have never learned anything from history or acted upon any lesson they might have drawn from it. I hope we will be wiser. So let us draw conclusions from our research and experience And may history be for us a lesson for the future. Thank you for your attention.
Let me now hand over the floor to Tomasz Schramm, the president of the Committee of Historical Sciences of the Polish Academy of Sciences.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, international congresses of historical sciences are sometimes a reflection not only of new phenomena and historiographic tendencies, but also of history itself, the one that happens on an ongoing basis. The congresses planned for 1918 in St. Petersburg and for 1943 in Rome did not come to fruition. The latter has raised great political and ethical questions in advance. Undertaken after the Second World War, the 5-year rhythm lasted for several decades, after which it was disturbed, fortunately in a less drastic and profound way. The COVID pandemic has caused a 2-year postponement of the Congress that we are inaugurating today. Delighted that it is happening after all, but also aware of the various losses, including human ones, that this event of global dimension has brought to our project. The shadow of war was also drawn in discussions and even decisions about the impossibility of participation in some congresses of historians from certain countries. Such a shadow also falls on the 23rd Congress, contributing to the complexity of the feelings with which we begin it. At this moment, however, speaking on behalf of the organizing committee of the Congress, I want to express one feeling: gratitude to all those whose committed work has brought today's success. It is my pleasant duty to thank the International Committee of Historical Sciences Board for the last 2 terms and the organizing committee. I would like to address personally Professor Andrea Giardina, President of ICHS and currently Honorary President, and Professor Catherine Orel, Secretary General and presently President of ICHS, as well as the successive rectors of Adam Mickiewicz University, who ex officio were co-chairs of the organizing committee. Rector Bogumiła Kaniewska is the 3rd person to hold this position. In our work, we have received valuable support from the authorities of the Wielkopolska region and of the city of Poznań, as well as from numerous institutions listed by Rector Kaniewska, for which I also express my sincere thanks. With particular emphasis, I express my gratitude to the executive department of the organizing committee, whose work began, in fact, 8 years ago at the stage of preparing the candidacy of Poznań, adopted in 2015. Under the leadership of Professor Krzysztof Makowski, it has been a real headquarter, overseeing day after day the setting, preparation and execution of the countless tasks that made up the great whole that it is now materializing. I believe that the coming days will go down well in the memories of the participants of the Congress as rich in scientific experiences, as well as in every other respect. I wish this with all my heart to all those who have gathered in our city due to this great event. Mesdames, Messieurs, chers collègues, les congrès internationaux de sciences historiques reflètent parfois non seulement le nouveau phénomène et tendances historiographiques, mais aussi l'histoire elle-même, l'histoire en train de se faire. Les congrès prévus pour 1918 à Saint-Pétersbourg et pour 1943 à Rome ne se sont pas concrétisés, ces derniers ont préalablement soulevé des questions politiques et éthiques majeures. Le rythme quinquennal entrepris après la Seconde Guerre mondiale s'est poursuivi pendant plusieurs décennies avant d'être perturbé, heureusement de manière moins drastique et moins profonde. La pandémie de Covid a entraîné le report de 2 ans du congrès que nous inaugurons aujourd'hui. Heureux qu'il ait tout de même lieu, mais aussi conscient de diverses pertes, y compris humaines, que cet événement d'ampleur mondiale a fait subir à notre entreprise. L'ombre de la guerre s'est manifestée aussi dans les discussions et même dans les décisions concernant l'impossibilité pour les historiens de certains pays de participer à certains congrès. Une telle ombre tombe également sur le 23e congrès, contribuant ainsi à la complexité des sentiments avec lesquels nous le commençons. En ce moment, cependant, au nom du comité d'organisation du congrès, je vais exprimer un sentiment, la gratitude envers tous ceux dont le travail dévoué a permis les succès d'aujourd'hui. Il est de mon devoir d'adresser mes remerciements au bureau du Comité international des sciences historiques pour les 2 derniers mandats, précédents et actuels, et au comité d'organisation. Je voudrais ici m'adresser nommément au professeur Andrea Giardina, président du CIS et actuellement président honoraire, et à la professeure Catherine Aurel, successivement secrétaire générale et présidente du CIS. Ainsi qu'au recteur successif de l'université Adam Mickiewicz, qui était d'office coprésident du comité d'organisation. Madame la recteure Bogumiła Kaniewska est la 3e personne à occuper ce poste. Dans le cadre de nos travaux, nous avons reçu un soutien précieux de la part des autorités de la voïvodie de Wielkopolska et de la ville de Poznań, ainsi que de nombreuses institutions nommées par Madame la recteure, pour lesquelles je tiens également à exprimer mes sincères remerciements. Avec une insistance particulière, je tiens à exprimer ma gratitude au département exécutif du comité d'organisation, dont le travail a en fait commencé il y a 8 ans au stade de la préparation de la candidature de Poznań, qui a été adoptée en 2015. Sous la présidence du professeur Krzysztof Makowski, c'était et c'est toujours un véritable état-major qui a veillé jour après jour à la définition, à la préparation et à l'exécution des innombrables tâches qui composent le grand ensemble qui se concrétise aujourd'hui. Je suis convaincu que les jours à venir resteront dans la mémoire des participants au congrès, aussi riches en expérience scientifique qu'à tout autre égard. Je le souhaite à tous ceux qui sont réunis dans notre ville par ce grand événement. Je vous remercie de votre attention. Thank you for your attention.
I would like to cede the floor to Marek Woźniak, the Marshal of the Wielkopolska region.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, it is an honor and a pleasure for me to welcome you to Poznań, the capital of Wielkopolska, a region that is the cradle of Polish statehood. This important meeting, the 23rd International Congress of Historical Sciences, makes me glad on 2 accounts. As a host of the region and as a graduate archaeology at Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań. In today's difficult times, when a war is being waged just across our border, and the climate crisis is increasingly making its mark on a globe, we are reminded again of the statement by Hegel, who claimed that history teaches us that man learns nothing from history. Let us not succumb to pessimism, however. Because history is more than a story about the past. It's also a vehicle for the values that create our identity. History also allows us to promote those values, such as democracy and human rights. Dear guests, Wielkopolska is one of the three most dynamically developing regions of our country. A region where the unemployment rate has been the lowest in Poland and Europe for several years, and where GDP per capita significantly exceeds the national average. This is a region that clearly pronounced its attachment to European democratic values, which has been confirmed by the results of elections to the national parliament and regional self-government for years. Wielkopolska is also a region with rich history. It is the cradle of Polish statehood. Places such as Lednica, Gniezno, or Ostrów Tumski in Poznań defined our country. This is where Poland came into being. Wielkopolska is also where the longest war in modern Europe was waged, where over 100 years of Polish patriot intense work in the territory of the Prussian partition led to the outbreak of the Wielkopolska uprising. If it hadn't been for the uprising, our country would have had a completely different shape and history in the last century. We are taking unique measures to nurture and cultivate the memory of our Wielkopolska uprising and its heroes. As a nation, for many years, Poles have preferred for the romantic trend to dominate, where heroes and martyrs are worshipped and winners are underappreciated. That is why we want to show this moment in history in the modern museum, the Museum of Wielkopolska Uprising, which will be built in Poznań. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank the organizers of the 23rd International Congress of Historical Sciences, the International Committee of Historical Sciences, the Committee of Historical Sciences of the Polish Academy of Sciences, and the MTP Group. My special thanks go to Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań and its rector, Bogumiła Kaniewska, and to the best faculty of history in Poland, which has played a very important role in the structure of the university for many years. I hope that the conversation about history here will also be a pretext to getting to know our region better. I wish all the participants fruitful deliberations. Thank you.
I invite Mariusz Wiśniewski, the Vice Mayor of Poznań, to take the floor.
Welcome to Poznań, ladies and gentlemen. I am proud that we have managed to meet here finally. Thank you very much for choosing our city, and words of thanks for all people who involved in the organization of the Congress. The more so because 2 years have passed since the scheduled date of the Congress. Today you see a slightly different city than the one you could have seen 2 years ago, because Poznań is changing very quickly now. One of the hand, we have started the renovation of the city center, which you have certainly already noticed. On the other hand, new tourist attractions are being created, such as Enigma Cyber Center, which is located 200 meters away. It is a new interactive center. We show how important cryptography was in the history of the world and how important role was played by Poznań mathematicians who broke the Enigma code before Second War. I encourage you to take a walk to this place, but also to other museums. When registering, you will receive a booklet describing these places along with vouchers, thanks to which you will visit these places free of charge. For my part, I invite you especially to the Poznań island between two rivers, Ostrów Tumski, the place where the history of Poland began over 1,000 years ago, where you will visit, among others, the interactive Poznań Gate, a place where you will learn why Poland was born here. I encourage you to explore the city, also thanks to the fact that your conference badge allows you to travel free of public transport. Do not forget about Poznań restaurants. Poznań chefs are among the best in the country, and it's not without reason that our city is referred to as a culinary capital of Poland. I wish you successful sessions and, of course, good time, good stay in our city. Thank you very much.
I welcome Andrea Giardina, the Honorary President of the International Congress of Historical Sciences, and invite him to take the floor.
This Congress is held in a historical phase in which many certainties that seemed acquired have collapsed one after the other in rapid sequence. We understood in 2020 that we are unable to control the animal world and prevent health catastrophes comparable in some respects to the great epidemics of the past, due to close contact between humans and animals. While the pandemic was still in progress, another belief often repeated in the media and in many political circles, despite the cautions expressed by some particularly competent and prudent historians, has failed. That, according which, in these parts of the planet, the risk of an explosion of a third world war was now over. Another perception has failed, according to which, among the many risks of the planet, that of a nuclear war was not the most realistic. Furthermore, while many have long imagined that nuclear power plants were a sort of inviolable sanctuary, ontologically protected from war violence, these days we are seeing the exact opposite. Finally, we have discovered that a so-called local war can be global for its consequences on energy and food supplies for entire continents, the richest as well as the poorest. The great German sociologist Ulrich Beck, who like few others has reflected on cosmopolitanism in contemporary societies, has masterfully represented in the dramatic contrast between the human effective cosmopolitan condition, interdependence, effective interaction and interchange on a planetary scale, and the absence of a cosmopolitan awareness. Beck believed that this was a dramatic situation that required an urgent solution. In one of his latest books, Zygmunt Bauman gave the problem an apocalyptic emphasis. In the present day, the contrast between the human effective cosmopolitan condition and the absence of a cosmopolitan consciousness has worsened. The cosmopolitan condition which person is not only rejected but refused, and inevitably most of mankind perceives only the negative effects of globalization on their existence, from an economic, social, environmental, health, emotional point of view. Everything that reaches us from near or far countries appears to be harmful, poisonous, aggressive, and inevitably the values of cosmopolitanism are overwhelmed by the perception of globalization as the enemy of nations and individuals. All the problems that I have briefly mentioned are represented in a large chronological dimension in the program of our Congress, and the formulations of the various themes also impose themselves for their originality. But anyone who reads the program understands that in this days, as in the next few years, the ICHS is an extremely important task, precisely in connection with the relationship between globalization and cosmopolitanism. It is a fundamental and exciting challenge. More than ever, this Congress shows that the ICHS is a precious institution to be protected in this difficult phase and to be developed. I believe that these short considerations are more than enough to make us feel immense gratitude for the commitments of colleagues from the organizing committee and the executive department in Poznań. Their willpower, their courage at times when many feared that this Congress would never be held, with unpredictable consequences on the future of our organization itself. Their political capacity, and no less important than the others, balance, patience, and institutional grace have aroused a general admiration. Thank you once again, President Schramm. Thank you, dear colleagues, dear Polish colleagues. Thank you, dear Polish friends. The board, for its part, has done a truly important job in its new composition with the new Secretary General Eduardo Tortaloro and the new President Catherine Orel. In my position, I want once again reiterate how precious was for me the collaboration with Catherine Orel, a collaboration that lasted 6 years. An important part of her commitment as Secretary General consisted in the attempt to broaden the composition of the ICHS by favoring the membership of countries belonging to continents still underrepresented in the ICHS. There have been good results and many difficulties, as the former Secretary General Robert Frank, who is here, and whom I greet with great gratitude, has personally experienced. But this now traditional policy of the ICHS is something that certainly will bear many fruits in the coming years, and which in any case has a moral value that cannot be reduced to the quantitative aspect. Catherine Aurel, as we all know, is a historian who has taken on an international dimension thanks to her studies on the so-called Central Europe, Cette Europe qu'on dit centrale, to evoke the title of Catherine's famous book from 2009, if I remember well. As is her style, Catherine has associated this research with the constant promotion of cultural contacts with the historiographies of Central Europe. This cultural organizational activity represents a heritage that Catherine Aurel made available to the ICHS during the years she was Secretary General and now as President. This is particularly important in the current situation because, precisely because of her strong vocation for dialogue. Thank you, Catherine, for what you did and still will do for the ICHS. With my best wishes for this Congress and a lot of gratitude for all the colleagues engaged in our works.
I would like to give the floor to Catherine Aurel, who is the president of the International Congress of Historical Sciences.
Dziękuję. Pani rektor Uniwersytetu Adama Mickiewicza, pan marszałek województwa wielkopolskiego, pan pierwszy zastępca prezydenta, drodzy kolegi, drodzy przyjaciele, chciałbym powiedzieć kilka słów po polsku na Otwarcie zjazdu Międzynarodowego Komitetu Nauk Historycznych. Witam Państwa w Poznaniu. Witam Państwa w Poznaniu i dziękuję wszystkim, którzy pracowali nad realizacją kongresu, który ostatecznie odbywa się po 2 latach odroczenia. Et maintenant en français. Et je suis contente d'avoir entendu quelques mots en français de la part de Thomas Schramm, très cher ami que je remercie, non seulement pour avoir parlé français, mais pour son amitié fort longue. Restons discrets sur le nombre d'années. Et donc en français, parce que nous sommes une organisation mondiale qui doit mettre en avant la diversité linguistique. Je rappelle que le CICH a 3 langues officielles, le français, l'anglais et l'espagnol. Les membres du bureau, qui vont vous être présentés dans un instant, sont tous des polyglottes. Et vous pourrez donc, pendant le congrès, il y aura un stand dédié au CICH dans le lieu, dans le Zamek, dans le château, au lieu de l'enregistrement du congrès, où vous pourrez chaque fois rencontrer des membres du bureau et vous adresser à eux dans n'importe quelle langue pratiquement, puisque cette organisation mondiale dispose d'une variété de langues dans lesquelles vous pouvez communiquer. Et d'ailleurs, je rappelle aussi, grâce à Tomáš, que lors de la présentation de la candidature de Poznań en Chine, au congrès de 2015, cette présentation s'était faite en 2 langues. Eva Domańska, ici présente, avait présenté en anglais et Tomáš avait présenté en français. Donc il y avait une vraie et belle diversité dans cette présentation. Ce que je voudrais dire aussi, c'est que, et ça a été souligné par les présentations précédentes, vous êtes évidemment bienvenus à Poznań. Il faut préciser que Poznań est aussi une ville gastronomique. Et je le dis en tant que représentante française. Et je salue ici l'un des représentants du tourisme de Poznań qui, lors de notre première visite, nous avait emmenés dans certains restaurants où nous avions pu goûter cette excellence de la cuisine à Poznań. Donc, n'hésitez pas, le midi, le soir, à aller profiter des restaurants de Poznań. Enfin, dernier mot en français, pour vous dire à quel point nous sommes heureux, émus de vous voir tous ici en vrai, de pouvoir à nouveau faire des accolades, nous saluer tous de façon amicale après ces années donc d'attente et puis de déception à cause de l'épidémie de Covid. Donc c'est non seulement des mots de remerciement que j'adresse à toute l'organisation du Congrès, et spécialement à Tomasz et à Krzysztof, sans qui rien n'aurait été possible, et puis à tous ceux qui ont contribué au Congrès, mais aussi un moment d'émotion de vous revoir tous, amis, collègues, parmi nous. Now I will switch to English, and as it is planned in the program of the opening ceremony, I will now introduce first the new members of the board. For the delegates who are attending now, you remember that last year we had this General Assembly online, and during this General Assembly we elected the new members of the board. So I will now introduce the new members of the board. I will ask them to please raise when their name is called, and afterwards we'll reintroduce the older members of the board so as to remind you of their personality. So I will start with Gunnlaug Fur. She's a professor at Linnaeus University in Sweden. She's currently serving as Deputy Vice Chancellor responsible for sustainability at her university, so she's very, very busy with that. And she focuses on cultural encounters, gender and post-colonial perspectives, as well as oral history and the uses of history. So we have one member who is missing, unfortunately for health reasons, nothing serious, it's not COVID, it's not, well, but he has to undergo rehabilitation and so he cannot travel. So he is Nuno Gonçalo Monteiro from Portugal. He's a professor at the University of Lisbon. He focuses on modern history, Brazil, Portuguese empire, and also cultural history. So now I turn to Katalin Sende. Thank you. Katalin is a professor of the very famous Department of Medieval Studies of Central European University in Budapest. Perhaps you remember that we had the former award winner Gabor Klanicaj also coming from this Department of Medieval Studies at CEU Budapest, so it tells you something about the excellence of this university. Kati is a medievist as well, and she is also an urban historian, and I would like to here enhance the role of the Commission for the History of Towns, which is extremely important inside of SISH. Marietta Jetala belongs to this commission, and so does Katalin Sende. Thank you. Eduardo Tottarolo, serving now as General Secretary. As you heard, there is a kind of a complot between France and Italy because we keep exchanging posts. So we had an Italian president and a French general secretary, and now we have the contrary. We have the reverse. We have a French president and an Italian general secretary. So Eduardo is a professor at the Università degli Studi del Piemonte Orientale, is a specialist of modern history, cultural history, and very important, belonging also to a very important commission inside of CISH, which is the Commission for the History of Historiography, which is a very, a key commission inside of the CISH. Thank you. Hirotaka Watanabe, Japan. I know Hirotaka for, I don't know how many decades, so I will not specify. Hirotaka is a professor at Teikyo University in Tokyo. He belongs to the Commission of International Relations. He is a specialist of international relations. He is a distinguished French speaker as well. He has also been a diplomat. He has served also in France during the Japan-French year in France, and he has this specialty of contemporary international relation, and so a distinguished member from Japan. Thank you. Now I will present you again the board members you already know, but it's always good to have their presentation again, because many of you maybe don't know them. So I will start with our Vice President, Eliana Dutra. Eliana is from Brazil. She is a professor at the University of Minas Gerais in Brazil. She is a very distinguished scholar of cultural studies, of history of books and edition. And she has been a key person in expanding the membership of national committees from Latin America. So without Eliana, we would have lost practically the contact to Latin America, and this is also thanks to her that we are now having in the room many members from Latin America. So Eliana, thank you very much. Joel Harrington, yes. Joel Harrington is professor for history and German studies at Vanderbilt University, US. He specialized in the Reformation and early modern Germany, which means you can talk German with him, and French and English also a polyglot. He has various research interests in legal and religious aspects of social history, and he did a recent excursion in the history of the Middle Ages, as I saw. So thank you, Joel. Matthias Miedel. University of Leipzig, Germany, Global and European Studies Institute. Matthias is also a specialist of modern history, French Revolution, history of historiography, global and trans-regional history, and the history of intercultural transfers. Matthias is also a key person in the network of global historians, of which we have several members attending here. Thank you. Krzysztof Makowski. Wow. You deserve a standing ovation at the end. He is also a vice president. We have two vice presidents, Eliana and Krzysztof. Well, for the Polish colleagues, it's absolutely useless to present Krzysztof, but for the others, I'm sorry, I have to. He is a professor here at the Faculty of Historical Studies in University Adam Mickiewicz. He is a specialist of 19th and early 20th century of Poland, with a particular focus on demographics, socioeconomics, social mobility, migration, women's and family history. His other area of expertise are the relations between nationalities in the region, especially Germans, Jews, and Poles, and the question of their identity, consciousness, and collective memory. And Krzysztof Makowski also conducts research into the history of historiography and sources study of the period he is concerned with. Standing ovation for Krzysztof, please. Sorry, I should have told you. I didn't want to embarrass you, but you deserve it so much. I mean, so, Sasha Zala. Actually, forget everything I said before. This is the key man. Sasha is our treasurer. So without Sasha, no SISH, no meetings, no Congress, nothing. So Sasha is from Switzerland. He's professor at the University of Bern, but he is also the director of the edition of the diplomatic documents of Switzerland. He is a specialist of international relations, interwar period, and history of border regions. But as I said, acting as our treasurer since 2017, he is absolutely the key person in maintaining and making SISH function from the point of view of finances. So thank you, Sasha. So I will not introduce myself because Andrea did it so nicely and it was very moving, actually. So as I said, you will have the occasion to meet the board members during the Congress, and please feel free to look for us, address us, ask questions, and the like. Now I would like to again join my words of gratitude to the organizing committee, thanks to whom we are now celebrating this opening ceremony. I must say that here the Polish colleagues struggled against all odds, not only the renovation of streets, but to achieve this exceptional event. As we were nearly freed from the sanitary problems, as you know, a war erupted just behind the Polish border. And thus, I really congratulate you all to have come to Poznań, to have come to attend this Congress, to not have been discouraged by the situation, and I think this is already a success for the organizing committee and for the local colleagues. So please enjoy the Congress, enjoy Poznań. Thank you very much.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, in the moment we will be witnesses of the historical debates Quo Vadis Historiae. Now I would like to thank you very much, our distinguished guests on the stage. Thank you for your opening speeches. Thank you for being with us here. But I would like to ask you to take a seat in the audience, of course, to enjoy our debate. Przed nami mała przerwa techniczna. During the little technical intermission, let me remind the names of persons who were with us on the stage. It was Professor Bogumiła Kaniewska, Director of Adam Mickiewicz University, Tomasz Szram, the President of the Committee of Historical Sciences of the Polish Academy of Sciences, Marek Woźniak, Marshal of the Wielkopolska region, Mariusz Wiśniewski, the Vice Mayor of Poznań, Andrea Giardina, the Honorary President of the International Congress of Historical Sciences, Catherine Norel, President of the International Congress of Historical Sciences, and members of the board of the International Congress of Historical Sciences. Professor Krzysztof Makowski, the Vice President, Professor Eliana Dutra, the Vice President, Professor Katalin Szende, Professor Hirotaka Watanabe, Professor Matthias Midel, Professor Sasha Zala, Professor Eduardo Tortarolo, Professor Gunluk Fur i Professor Joel Harrington. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, someone said that history doesn't change the past, but likely it changes the future. So that's why it's so important to find the resolution, to find the answer for the question, Quo vadis historia? Let's enjoy debate. Let me invite on the stage Catherine Norel, the President of the International Congress of Historical Science, who introduced us to the debate, and also the participants of the debate, Olufunke Adeboye from Nigeria, Dipesh Chakrabarti from the United States of America, and Ewa Domańska from Poland. Enjoy.
Sorry, it's me again. I have the pleasure of introducing the debate, well, the presentations you will now hear from our distinguished scholars, colleagues, on Quo vadis historiae, so a reflection on our tasks, our duties as historians, and maybe also on the future we plan for our discipline. So our first speaker is Professor Adeboye from Nigeria, from Lagos. She is a specialist of social history. She is also a dean of the Faculty of Arts in her university. She focuses on gender, pre-colonial and colonial Nigerian history, but also on historiography, religion. She was awarded in 2011 the Gertie Hessling Prize. And in her talk, she asks, where is history going in Africa? And she also appeals to African historians to join this kind of international committee, international associations. And she reminds us that at one moment, actually, we had an African Historians Association being a member of our organization. And unfortunately, this has somehow not disappeared, but lost interest. So in her talk, she also gives indications on how we should mobilize the younger generation of not only historians from Africa, but also on historians who deal with African history in European, American, Latin American countries to connect with each other more, maybe more efficiently or in a more transnational manner than they used to do until now. So let me please ask Professor Adeboye to take the floor.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Let me align myself with the protocol established during the earlier session so that I don't miss out anyone if I decide to acknowledge all the distinguished historians here by their names. It's a delight for me to be in the midst of eminent historians at this intellectual convocation, especially after 2 consecutive postponements of the Congress. The past 2 years have been quite eventful for the entire world due to the ravages of the COVID-19 pandemic. While we are relieved that normalcy is gradually being restored to our world, we equally commiserate with those who lost their loved ones or suffered grievous impairment as a result of the pandemic. We are gathered here to celebrate the discipline of history and its associated sciences, to assess how far the field has come and to chart a new course for the future. This will also include prescriptions of viable solutions for its identified challenges. My focus in this presentation is on the practice of history in Africa. And I'll start by defining this practice from traditional and modern perspectives, and then trace the journey of African history, unearthing the roots of modern African historiography. And then next, I discuss the multiple dimensions of the crisis faced by African historiography in the last quarter of the 20th century, and also address the contemporary state of history in some parts of the continent. And then finally, I try to conclude by peering into the future. Now, this is a very ambitious task that I've given myself, so I will not attempt to read the full text here. It's already published for everyone. I'll just speak to the PowerPoint slides that I have here. So the next section is what I titled The Python's Eye, Elders' Rags, and the Academic Clue. This is where I try to define the practice of history in Africa from traditional perspectives into the academic definitions. I so much love the metaphor used by one of our elders in the discipline in Africa, Professor E.J. Alagwa. He used this Ikwere metaphor. The Ikwere, this is an ethnic group in the south of Nigeria. And they said that the eye of the man with local roots is as penetrating as the eye of the python. The mind of the man with local roots is as penetrating as the eye of the python. What this underscores is the consciousness of past cultural heritage. There is another saying in Yoruba philosophy that talks about elders' rags, that no matter how trendy the wardrobe of the modern youth is, he or she can never compete with an elder when it comes to rags. The rags represent the experience of the elder and the historical mind, the knowledge that the elder has accumulated over the years. So in traditional African communities where oral history was practiced, these were some of the few ideas that were common there, used to communicate the value of history, the meaning of history. There are practices of professional and non-professional, traditional oral historians. I won't go into that. You have a lot of non-academic historians that were recognized within this traditional society. Now, when we come to academic historiography, we have quite a number of African historians that have also attempted to define the practice of history. P.T. Zeleza talks about history being like peering into the foggy future through the prism of the past. You also have Professor Erim O. Erim, who defines history as organized and critical study of past activities that have impacted the present. Many other historians define history in similar ways, and these definitions resonate with other mainline definitions, even from other places outside Africa. The bottom line is that history is seen as production of knowledge to enable society to understand the present better and anticipate the future. Now, before we begin to discuss where we're going, what has been the journey so far? Again, I will just skip through this. First, you have the imperialist or colonial historiography, represented by the writings of Hegel, Newton, Seligman, Hugh Trevor Roper, that denied Africa of its own history. And then this took sway until the end of the Second World War. Within the second half of the 19th century and to the end of the Second World War, you also had these non-academic historians, early African historians, people like James Africanus Houghton from Sierra Leone, P.D. Boylat from Senegal, and then we have John Mensah Seba from the Gold Coast, Carl Christian Randolph, also from the Gold Coast, Samuel Johnson, Akigasai from Nigeria, Apolukagwa from Uganda. There were several of these non-academic historians. What they did was to preserve the knowledge of traditions, customs, and values, and they tried to correct the prejudices of imperialist historiography. And then another historiographical tradition that came after this was nationalist historiography. This was the intellectual arm of the decolonization move, and this is where we have the renowned schools of history, the Ibadan School of History, with pioneers like Kenneth Owu-Kadike, Joseph Anene, J.F. Adeajayi, S.O.B. Obaku in the first generation, the Dakar School of History, with scholars like Abdoulaye Lai and Cheikh Anta Diop, also in the first generation. You had several generations that followed them. And then in East African historical practices, you had B.A. Ogot, Bethel Alan Ogot, in East African historical studies. So this nationalist historiography has also been criticized for its deep bourgeois biases and theoretical poverty by the next school of historians that came after them. This is what we call the political economy approach. And the concern of this school was to explain the persistent underdevelopment that existed in Africa after political economy. The mantra of Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana was, seek ye first the political kingdom, and then every other thing shall be added unto you. But after the political kingdom was achieved through independence, the development that was anticipated wasn't forthcoming, and so scholars had to explain this. And then you had this political economic approach, the dependency theory, popularized by the Dar es Salaam School of History in Tanzania. And then you had the mode of production theory from Dar es Salaam it also moved to ABU, Ahmadu Bello University in Zaria, Nigeria. Now, from here, I want to talk about crises in African historiography. Thank you. The main crisis that first came up was the crisis of relevance within Africa. That is the crop of history that was produced following independence. People started to question it, of what relevance was it for nation building, because at that time, when various African nations were involved in nation building, they needed some intellectual support from historians, and it was as if the history that was generated was not usable for that nation building. So I have also identified many of the critiques. The issue of theoretical poverty was also there, that like the Ibadan School of History, for instance, yes, they generated a lot of historical literature, lot of narratives, but the critique has been that the theoretical backbone was missing. And then others have criticized this African historiography for its bourgeois inclinations. It focused on the rulers, the leaders, the big traders, and did not look at the people in the margins of society, the masses, and all of that. And so it was declared that this historiography could not foster political, social, and economic transformation. And so what were the physical symptoms that manifested? By the last quarter of the 20th century, professional associations declined. Historical Society of Nigeria, Historical Society of Ghana, and in several other places. And then the landmark publications of many of these societies also stagnated. Student enrollment dropped. In fact, for some places, the history honors program had to struggle to get students to enroll. There was a case in East Africa, Dar es Salaam in 1994, that there was nobody registered for the history honors program. And in places like Nigeria too, history was scrapped from secondary school curriculum at the junior secondary level. Why did all this happen? Government had to make budgetary cuts. That was the era of the structural adjustment programs. Many African nations are taking loans from IMF, World Bank, and they had these conditionalities, and this affected the humanities. In fact, some scholars call this the peripheralization of history. Humanities were marginalized, but history suffered hard. Outside Africa, you also had the crisis of institutional decline in offshore African schools of history as listed here. Now, let me quickly rush to the contemporary state of history in Africa. What is the contemporary state now? I'll be looking at attempts by historians and by various institutions to resolve some of these challenges. First, we have the introduction of new themes: environmental history, women and gender history, informal economy, social history, crime, family, sexuality, diseases, healthcare. The idea was to break away from the routine of the political history that had been so paramount during the previous eras. And then one of the landmark publications that came out during this time, you had the UNESCO General History of Africa. In 8 volumes, the scheme, though launched in 1964, published the volume 8 in 1999, and then since then, 3 additional volumes are also being prepared to address African diaspora and new trends in African history. And even for the ones that are already in print, that they have been abridged, and then they have also tried to provide elementary versions for students in the secondary schools. Again, still talking on the contemporary state of history in Africa, rebranding of some history departments to address the issue of drop in enrollment. Many history departments have had to rebrand themselves. And even among historians, this has also caused a lot of debate. Because some will say, yes, it was rebranding. Others will say it was a hybridization. History and International Relations, Department of History and Diplomatic Studies, Department of History and Archaeology and Anthropology. The idea is to bring in this multidisciplinary perspective to enhance the practice of history. And then there's also been the rewriting of African history as part of reconfiguring and decolonizing African studies. Many of the textbooks that have been used over the years, many of the famous books that have been embraced, now are being reread, and a lot of historians are rewriting the same history using internal sources from Africa. A revival of professional associations that have declined, and then we also have the promotion and strengthening of new historiographical schools. The Ibadan School of History, the Dakar School of History of the 1960s, 1970s, they are no longer as vibrant as they are, but in some other places, new school of histories are coming up. In Lagos, we have, in the Department of History and Strategic Studies, this is also part of the rebranding that took place. We have a lot of focus on economic history and international relations. So another school, another trajectory of history came out of that. And there is continuous human capacity development with the digital turn. And then talking of publication outlets, we have several African history journals, several journals dedicated to the publication of research on African history, and even in some mainstream journals on African studies, they also devote special space to African history. Now, before I conclude, I also want to underscore the contributions of African scholars in diaspora to this move. There are so many, but I just highlighted Tony Falola and P.T. Zeleza. These two scholars have contributed a lot. And what is interesting to me now in what they do is that now that they have accumulated a lot of experience, their writings are now like macro histories. It's like they started from the micro and now they are moving to the macro. They're distilling the key essence of previously reconstructed past and publishing that. That is a very key contribution. So I try to conclude by peering into the future. What does the future hold for history in Africa? And in my write-up, I use a folk tale there, that there were two friends that visited the big oracle to divine, for divination about their future. The oracle told one of them that it would be prosperous in life. And then the oracle told the second one that it would die a pauper. But when the two of them got home, the one that was told would be prosperous, he went partying. He was so happy. He stopped working hard. And over time, he lost all he had. And he died a pauper. But the other guy that was told would die a pauper said no, he will not agree with our verdict. He worked hard, mobilized all his resources, he became very prosperous. He died a wealthy man. How does this relate to the future of history in Africa? It is what we make of it. The future is bright, and there are many trajectories that are available to the African historian, but we have a lot of work to do. Each nation or region periodically has to review their research agenda to refine methodology, to embrace multidisciplinary perspective and the use of theories. There are still some history departments, some schools of history that still believe that what they're practicing is pure history that should not be diluted with influences from other disciplines. And with the way things are going now, it's very difficult for such purist schools to survive. Because even to attract students, to attract research grants, there is no way you will get a grant when you are the only one from your discipline doing the research without collaborating with others. So these are things we need to look at. Reforming the history curriculum at all levels through a holistic approach, reforming course content, required resources, and pedagogical overhaul. And there is also need for more continental mobilities and exchange. And collaboration and interaction, even with congresses and with opportunities like this. Creation of regional centers of excellence, that is also very important, so that horizontal networking should also be encouraged and a strong continental association. I know we have a lot of national association of historians, but moving beyond the national will mean we would have a continental association that can easily also embrace international associations like this. So, as I conclude, I say the world has changed and continues to change, but history has to remain relevant. And if history has to continue to be relevant, then the way we practice history has to change. And we cannot insist that it was the way we did it several decades ago that we'll still continue to do it. African history research and teaching should be innovative and creative. And the end is that we want to generate penetrating analysis like the gaze of a determined python. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So you will see that actually the three communications, the three presentations have very much in common, being also, of course, different, but looking from different angles at what is before us, what we expect from our practice of history, as historians, what we have in mind when we do history, and what we should probably try to improve in our practice as teachers, researchers, constantly keeping in mind not to be hypnotized by the python, but to go beyond this hypnotizing force of tradition, sources, archives, and move beyond this to go even more transnational, transdisciplinary, and so on, without losing substance. Because, of course, you can call everything global, but in the end, what is the change you experience in your practice as historian? So you will see now in the next presentation by Dipesh Chakrabarti that this presentation have very much in common. So Dipesh Chakrabarti is maybe the very personification of the global scholar, because looking at his biography, you will see he has been everywhere. Teaching, researching, practicing history in practically in all continents, and he's also a specialist of what has been talked about also in Professor Adeboye's speech about subaltern history. This is one of the aspects of his studies. He started as a social and labor history of labor historian, then he moved on to post-colonial studies and to subaltern studies, and now is very much interested in Anthropocene and climate history, climate change, and what does it mean for us historians. And this is, of course, particularly important in nowadays events and climate change. So, Dipesh, please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Good. Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here, to have been invited to address you. And what I'm going to do in the 20 or so minutes I have at my disposal is really sort of share with you an answer that I failed to give sometime back in Berlin when I was presenting some of my research to a gathering of all the centers of excellence that set up. When the German historian of Africa, my good friend Andreas Eckart, came up to me after my talk and said, Dipesh, you once used to talk about labor, and now you talk about the planet. What's the connection? And the question has haunted me because I didn't have a ready-made answer for Andreas. So what I'm sharing with you is my answer that I would have given if I had had the presence of mind or had enough thought about it. And what I'm framing it is a particular genre of history writing, not historian genre, but the kind of genre that Enlightenment philosophers, Kant included, would have called conjectural or speculative history. I especially have in mind Kant's essay on a speculative history of mankind, where he reads the Genesis as the basis for some kind of historical thinking. So I'm presenting these conjectural histories, and this is my answer to Andreas. The two words used in English to designate work itself and labor, give us a convenient point of entry into the question that I'm trying to explore in my mind. They're not the same word, labor and work. In European languages, at least in English, German, and French, and I only have a smattering of German and French, the status of the word labor appears to have followed a somewhat similar trajectory. It is a story that I think of as a story with a happy ending, but a sad beginning. So even with my very elementary searches, I found that the German words arbeiten, arbeiter, arbeit, they all have a connection to the Proto-Indo-European root word for orphans. And the connection is that orphans, child laborers, were associated with torturous forms of labor. So the word arbeiten has to do with the kind of hard work that labor means in English too. One reason why we call giving birth laboring. Labor then refers to something privative, to the plight of hard work, a meaning also conveyed by the French word for labor, travail, the sense of which is preserved in the English word travail. So across these languages, one actually sees that the word labor has these sorts of beginning in what I call stories of sadness. But if we look at the more modern history of these words, we find that we are presented with romanticized positive histories. For having started with a sad connection to intense bodily toil, and the toil was not always human, it included the bodily toil of animals. The word ends up in the 19th century, or I should say from the 17th century on, in political philosophical traditions as words charged with a sense of morality that clearly has Christian roots. So the idea, and Locke is famous for saying that labor is something you have to mix in with soil in order to own the soil, which finally allowed for the civilizational come racist argument that Europeans used in many places in taking over land from indigenous people, the concept of terra nullius, that the indigenous people didn't really live like humans because they didn't mix their labor in with the soil, and therefore the land could belong to somebody else, could be taken away from them. So this argument that the indigenous lived only off the gifts of the land, like other animals do, This argument was, of course, has been completely discredited by later research. Additionally, if we think of early 19th century philosophers like Hegel, who has already figured, interestingly, in so many of these talks, and of course his famous followers like Marx and Engels, we find that the Christian word labor becomes a secular word. And one of the most popular words of the 19th century social and historical thought, labor became associated with laboring classes, with the world historical figure of the working class, the proletariat, and its associations became heroic. Engels, for instance, famously maintained that a key factor that made humans different from apes was the fact that we humans labored. So the philosophies of history that based themselves on such an understanding of labor came to be a good, in these philosophies, labor came to be a good aspect of being human. It is in that sense that I say that the word labor ended up being a happy word in the 19th century, even though the roots suggest a sad beginning. The word eventually came to be synonymous with hard work, and in Anglophone historiography, famous historians Eric Hobsbawm would write a book called Laboring Men. When Marx described abstract labor as so much expenditure of energy of nerves and muscles, he actually abolished the distinction between labor and work. But the word work has a different origin than labor. Its etymological connections go back to the ancient Greek word ergon, that is part of the word energy, which is how we get words like synergy or allergy, and which is also why, at least from 17th century on, physicists began to define work as energy spent. So what I want to suggest to you is that work and energy connoted something other than bodily toil or labor, even though in the 19th century we came to use them as meaning the same, which is what also allowed Adam Smith to talk about the work of nature. In recent time, Anthropocene scholars like Jason Moon and others have talked about the work that the planet Earth does. So starting from different origins, the word labor and work have come closer. They came closer in the 19th century and since. And indeed that closeness is a key to today's crisis of work, where the imagined proletariat of early 19th and 20th centuries has been replaced by what the British economist Guy Standing called the precariat of the 21st century, as distinct from the proletariat. That is, people with only fragmented, precarious, non-continuous, isolated forms of employment that Uber drivers or solar panel installers have, for instance. We have come to a stage of capitalist production where we know that work is being done because wealth and productivity are growing, but it's not necessarily being done by humans. Work could be done by machines, by digital technology, or by harnessing artificial intelligence. As I said, work as a concept, because it's a concept that involves expenditure of energy, does not automatically refer to humans. Whereas labor is a concept that points back to the idea of bodily toil of human or animals. Today's discussions of the idea of a basic universal income actually portends a future of many without work, while productivity, thanks to technology, the application of AI, for instance, soars. So E.P. Thompson, Eric Hobsbawm, Harry Beverman, I already mentioned, many other significant historians have told us about the story of the struggle between workers and capitalists over the processes by which individual workers' labor was to be transformed into machinic work. That story now sounds distant. One could say that over time, the word work as applicable to all human and non-human processes of spending energy has come to dominate, marginalizing the word labor. The more we get enmeshed in systems of work in which technology accomplishes much more than the labor of humans, including intellectual technology, you just have to see how Google Translate has been taken over superseded by DeepL translation. And only the other day I was checking with a French friend, a DeepL translation of a poem by Rimbaud called Les Amis, the Friends. And my French friend was absolutely stunned to see how good the translation was. And that is where machine is doing intellectual work. That is the century in which the human imprint on the rocky surface of the planet would become, as some would argue, geologically recognizable. As the historian John McNeill has pointed out, the 20th century, particularly since the war, has been a time of extraordinary change, what they're now calling the Great Acceleration. And whether you look at human population, whether you look at production, consumption, production of energy, everything has grown exponentially, and actually grown exponentially. Initially, if you track the curves, you break them down, the great acceleration graphs are very well known, you'll find that 50s were because of reconstruction, post-war reconstruction in the advanced economies. Then the countries that decolonized, like India and other places, they began to produce their own industrial civilization. And once China and India liberalized their market, it just grows even more exponentially. And if you think of population, humanity is about 300,000 years old. We were 1.6 billion at 1900. 2000, we are 6 billion. It is clearly growing, and that's why they call it great acceleration. And not only that, humans have become the most important geomorphological agent on the planet. Geomorphology is the study of landscapes. So humans now move more soil around than all the rivers of the world taken together. And the geologist has said that if you look at all the technology we produce, our technosphere, everything we build on the basis of the biosphere, computer systems, smartphones, CDs, to waste in landfills, is staggering in scale, representing a mass of more than 30 trillion tons. So the weight of the technosphere, the technology we have produced, including digital technology, represents a mass of more than 50 kilos for every square meter of the planet's surface. So this is an expansion of the realm of work, keeping in mind my distinction between work and labor. The situation also produces a fascinating problem in the humanities, which is that the problem of what I call encountering the planet within humanistic thought. And let me quickly now go over this aspect of what I mean by the planet. And in trying to think about the planet, I'm both thinking with but also against a philosopher, a German philosopher, whom I read as one of the most romantic historians of labor, but he would be, of course, shocked to hear him being described as a historian. But this is the person I have in mind is not Karl Marx, but Martin Heidegger. And German philosophers have a specially developed tradition of thinking about the human condition. Now, I'm dealing with Heidegger, and Heidegger repels many people, and we're particularly situated in a time now which reminds us of the negative aspects of this man, but just taking up in philosophy and trying to explain where I disagree with him. Let me go back to him. So if you think about the tradition within which Heidegger is a major figure, there were 3 words that became philosophical words within that tradition. And those words in English are world, earth, and globe, no planet. The planet was not a philosophical word in that body of thought. In fact, Heidegger introduced the word earth itself as a philosophical category in 1936 in a lecture he gave in Frankfurt, which eventually became his famous lecture on art, published in the book on the poetics of language. Gadamer, his student, said it was startling to hear a philosopher talk about earth as a philosophical category, as though it were as important as the category like matter or form in philosophy. If you follow Heidegger, whether through the famous essay on the question concerning technology, or at the moment of his kere or turn, in his thinking, or when he speaks of the world as picture, or through his thoughts on art, you will find that he carefully separates the earth from the planet. And he says this rocky material called the planet is for astronomers. We have no use for it. It might from time to time produce a volcanic eruption. It might cause a tsunami. But it itself is not of concern to the human. Actually, when you look at how humans have dealt with the planet, that is this entity that produces a volcanic eruption or a tsunami, you will find that humans have dealt with it by bringing it within human concerns. So Voltaire's famous debate in the context of the Lisbon earthquake with the dead Leibniz about whether a debate about theodicy, whether it could be evil in God's world, right? Where the whole phenomenon of the volcanic eruption was made into the question that if God was good, then why would 90,000 people die? In 1934 in India, there was a very famous earthquake, famous for political reasons. We've had many earthquakes. That happened in the state of Bihar in 1934. And Mahatma Gandhi, who was then in Madras, now called Chennai, made a public statement saying this earthquake is a punishment for our own sin that we have considered a group of our own people untouchable. And Tagore, who by then was a Nobel laureate in literature, write to Gandhi saying, we are a country that is immersed in superstition. Is it true that you stood up at a public podium and spread this superstitious idea that the earthquake is a punishment for the sin of untouchability? And it's very interesting. Gandhi wrote back to him saying, yes, not only did I say it, I'll say it again. And Tagore said, well, I want to check with you because I want to contradict you and oppose you in public. And Gandhi said, of course you should. So Tagore put out a statement saying, this is wrong. But you can see how Gandhi, again, was trying to fold something of natural history into a human moral history, thinking this earthquake is a punishment. So Heidegger was right in that sense, that the planet, the astronomical body, was of no concern to humans. So for him, the earth was an aspect of the planet that turns its face towards humans, which is why he thought humans could be in a communicative relationship with the earth. Humans came into their essence only for him, only when they developed language. And the reason that Heidegger considered language to be the house of being was that only an animal with language could, in his view, look around and wonder about the meaning of existence of trees, water, fish, everything around them, and ask, who is this for? And what does it mean that they exist? What does it mean that I exist? And therefore Heidegger romantically, almost mystically and poetically, writes that the question of being, the question of what it means, what it means to be, could only be left to an animal that had language. And that is why he said, the question of being is vouchsafed to humans. The earth itself is something that Heidegger thought that had poesis built into it. The earth brings forth things. The earth brings forth fruit. The earth brings forth fish. And this bringing forth is something that a human, a traditional peasant or an indigenous person relies on when he sows the field with seeds and then depends on the earth to do its work. Heidegger distinguishes that from his view that technology is about holding a gun to the head of the planet Earth and forcing it to produce more than it would normally produce to meet our growing needs. But I'll come back to this point. Something of the Heideggerian sensibility was there in early thinking, and again the early thinking on sustainability goes back to Germany, to my knowledge, and some of the early chemists that Marx was reading, for instance, when he was taking notes for the volumes that became Theories of Surplus Value. You can see that there was up until the French physiocrats and even later, in the early 19th century, there was a sense that production, when we produce something, humans don't work by themselves. Even in Marx's citations from Ricardo in the Theories of Surplus Value, there is the question of the work that water does as steam, or the work that air might do. So this idea that you have something from the gifts of nature has roots, I think, of the same kind, that the earth has poesis, it builds something, and Heidegger's recommendation, of course, was that that's what we need to get back to. Today, the realm of work, what I've been calling the realm of work, has expanded. Thanks to revolutionary changes in technology beyond anything Heidegger could have seen or imagined. But we could still retrieve some points from his thinking, while we also need to go beyond his thoughts and challenge him, especially when he says the planet is of no concern to humans. Actually, the planet has come to be of concern to humans, which is why it's part of everyday news. When the realm of work expands like it has, then what we have is a technological relationship to Earth, where we move away from poesis as a mode of creation, and move into a mode of demand from the Earth, a German expression that Heidegger uses, which in English is usually translated as challenging forth. Not bringing forth, but being challenged to bring forth. It is like holding a gun, as I said, and the gun could be an oil rig that goes downwards, or industrialized farms to produce more fish or meat or chicken. In fact, currently the most populous bird on the planet is broiler chicken. 21 billion. And the next most populous bird, which is naturally populous, is 1.5 billion. So if you look at the number of cattle, number of sheep, you'll find how we have increased animal production as well for our own purposes. This is why Heidegger's examples are always traditional windmill, the traditional peasant. So he could say humans have traditionally lived with the poiesis of the world. But what even he didn't think about at the time is this massive expansion of what I'm calling work, which includes work that has no reference to humans. Work is really a seamless flow between what a river can do, what a waterfall can do, what technology can do, and what I can do. It is not specific to humans. And the way capitalism has expanded is precisely by moving away from labor, which references human toil. And that's why we can become redundant to capitalism as laborers. When that happens, you'll encounter what you spoil. What you encounter when you spoil the earth is the planet. The planet, in contrast to the earth, is indifferent to us. And I'm coming to the end of my talk. So the planet is what you see when you read the literature on earth system science, the science from which the concept of Anthropocene comes. You will find that it's not at all surprising that James Lovelock, who invented theory of Gaia and used to work for Carl Sagan's NASA, studying Mars. James Hansen, the patron science of climate change in the United States, was studying Venus. And the whole science of global warming comes out of comparative studies of rocky planets and how their atmosphere works. The key question in this science is not the human-centric idea of sustainability. It is what they call habitability. What makes a planet habitable for complex life? And the real question is that, I don't know if it of any, but I think historians will have to think about it. To think of ourselves as part of the history of life on this planet and history of complex life on this planet, because one possible result of what we are doing is another great extinction. That's what they're saying in 300 to 600 years. So the key question is not the homocentric idea of sustainability, it's what the scientists call planetability. What makes a planet habitable for complex life? And just to give you one quick example, when as a historian I use the word modern, I normally don't go beyond the last 500 years. Some people are very strict. They will say modern is the period 1815 to 1914, which is how Chris Bailey defines his book on the modern world. When I read earth system science, I find these scientists are using the word modern to talk about what they call our modern atmosphere. Our modern atmosphere. And they date it from 375 million years ago. And this atmosphere is modern because the Earth formed an atmosphere where the share of oxygen was kept at a level for almost 400 million years, allowing for animal life, plant life, and human life to flourish. So, without this, we don't breathe, we don't live. We do nothing to produce, to keep supplying the oxygen. Phytoplanktons and other so-called inferior forms of life do that. So they call it our modern atmosphere, but the word our cannot be used in a possessive sense. It's not the way you can say my house. You can't say our in that possessive sense. So in that sense, so the central question is, how can life sustain itself, complex life, despite the 5 great extinctions that the planet has seen? Now there is then, when we put it like this in Heideggerian terms, a properly planetary question. For this planet, unlike his category Earth, which brings things forth for humans. So he gives this example that when the tree bears a sweet fruit, it is as if the earth is rising as the sap of the tree to greet me in the shape of a fruit. But with the planet, I don't have this sense of mutuality. It does not look at me. It doesn't produce this modern atmosphere with humans in mind. All projects of sustainability are in some ways romantic projects about getting the earth back, wresting the earth from the hands of the planet. Post-humanist scholars like Jane Bennett or Bruno Latour try to get us back to the earth and not necessarily Heidegger's earth, by acknowledging the multiple ways we are entangled with the earth, by moving away from an exclusively human conception of labor, by moving away from an exclusively human focus on history writing, and therefore referring to multiple agency, actor networks, all that the Earth system scientists have brought us face to face with, the Earth system itself a story of entanglements. The planet, the object of Earth system science, that is the Earth system, is now knocking on our door to be accepted as a category in humanist and historical thought, not just scientific thought. Will we be able to wrest the Earth back from the planet? I don't know, but let me conclude by circling back to my friend Andreas Eckart's comment to me in Berlin that I mentioned at the very beginning. perhaps thinking through the differences between the two words, labor and work, might help us to bring the planet into conversations that will see the beginning of a planetary humanities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deepesh, for having also challenged our conception of time, going back to I don't know how many million years. But as you know, the classical distinction between periods is constantly being put into question for us historians, because what is ancient, medieval, modern, and contemporary history, how long is contemporary history going to last? You know, we will now turn to the future. And Eva Domańska is going to tell us a few things about not only the future of history, but also the future of writing history, the future of doing historiography, because this is one of her topics. Eva is not only a professor here at Adam Mickiewicz University, she also teaches at Stanford. She has held scholarships, Fulbright positions in the United States. She was, as I said before, one of the leading forces behind the application of Poznań to hold this Congress. Doing her work on historiography, she has edited works and studies about such authors like Hayden White, Natalie Zemon Davis, Robert Darnton, and so on. And recently, being very often, regularly in the United States, she has also developed a very big interest into postmodern, post-colonial topics and history. So I can already tell you that her talk will be, just as the two present presentations, very stimulating. Eva, please.
Dear fellow historians from around the world and from many different worlds, I am a transdisciplinary and future-oriented historian. I am interested in history and the theory of historiography, also in environmental humanities, especially in interdependencies between ecocides, genocides, and epistemicides. I work at the Faculty of History at Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań, but also, as Catherine said, I am a recurrent visiting professor at Stanford University. My epistemic standpoint is important because, like many of us these days who are doing research, teaching, and living our lives in various parts of the world, we are bridging various knowledges of the past, standpoints, worldviews, and cosmologies. As a historian from East Central Europe, from so-called epistemic margins, I have been colonized by knowledge produced by Western academia, yet I am also contributing to the slow but ongoing process of indigenizing knowledge of the past by infusing global knowledge with drops of our local knowledges and ways of knowing the past. When using the term indigenization, I refer to the work of Daniel Wildcat, a Yuchi member of the Muskogee Nation of Oklahoma, who claims, indigenization is a set of practices that results in processes in which people seriously re-examine and adopt these particularly unique cultures that emerge from the places they choose to live today. It is an acknowledgement that old ways of living contain useful knowledge for our lives here and now. I am going to follow Daniel Wildcat and consider indigenization as an alternative to thinking in terms of decolonization. Doing so allows me to use as a reference point not a term burdened with violence, such as colonization, or in the case of Poland and other ex-satellite countries of the Soviet Union dependency, but instead a more positive term referring to local pasts, knowledges, and ways of living. However, I want to stress that I am not going native. I am not advocating here some sort of nationalism or nativism. Rather, I observe how Eastern Central Europe, like other intellectual provinces, is still often approached by some Western scholars with a colonial attitude, as an ideal place to study atavistic examples of homophobia, anti-Semitism, nationalism, populism, and exoticized post-socialist condition. Such images are one-sided and harmful. They perpetuate the treatment of provincial historians as an important source of knowledge about local events and as a kind of native informants, but not as equal partners of sophisticated discussions that might substantially contribute to globally created historical knowledge. I am obviously not dismissing Western knowledge, since it forms a base of my cultural and intellectual heritage. But what I intend to do is to contribute to the emergence in the far future of a more holistic, inclusive, transcultural knowledge of the past that would respect various ontologies and cosmologies. In my interest in non-Western knowledges, and their status in global academia exposes my post-dependency condition as a scholar from East Central Europe. It reflects the call for epistemic justice manifested in a slogan proposed by the Polish art historian Piotr Piotrowski, "Provinces of the world unite." This interest also manifests itself in my standpoint as a scholar living today in the shadow of a real war, real ecological disaster, and real economic crisis, living in reality that brings back the worst and most notorious images from the past that we, as historians from Europe after World War II, hope that it would never return. Indeed, in the oft-repeated speech act of never again, history is manifested only in again, but certainly not in never. But I am not here to complain. We cannot afford to lament. I would prefer instead to wonder about ways to mobilize the imagination and to prefigure potential futures we might hope for. We need a critical hope that, as the Brazilian educator and philosopher Paulo Freire said, needs practice in order to become historical concreteness. I practice critical hope every day. It is my obligation, especially here and now, even if historians probably have fewer reasons these days to be hopeful. As Edward Carr in What is History claims, good historians have the future in their bones. So if you feel pain, it's not rheumatism. It's history. Thus, historians have reasons to worry, not only because of the current political, social and ecological situation, but also because as historians we are confronting major challenges related to our struggle for epistemic security with respect to memory politics, to sustaining an autonomy of the discipline of history, which is melting into the broad field of historical studies, and to extinction anxiety, as the Polish historian Anna Brzezińska called it. I find critical hope in what the Israeli artist and scholar Ariella Azulay called potential history. This approach makes it possible to extract from the past its unrealized possibilities as a necessary condition for imagining a different future. Potential history explores the past as a storehouse of human possibility, thus becoming a kind of laboratory that shows the conditions for coexistence and cohabitation in the world. It demonstrates that change is possible. I was teaching and doing research at Stanford University last spring. Robert Wall Kimmerer, an indigenous environmental scientist and a specialist in plant ecology, a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, was hosted by Stanford in May 2022. I attended Kimmerer's sparkling lecture, which communicated to the audience the message of traditional ecological knowledge. In her teaching, Kimmerer reminds us that a teacher comes when you are ready. And if you ignore its presence, it will speak to you more loudly, but you have to be quiet to hear. Later, I learned that a similar version of the saying, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear, is attributed to Buddha, Lao Tzu, or described as a Zen maxim and an old Chinese proverb. Kimmerer refers to living world as a teacher, to the land and plants as our oldest teachers and guides. But as a scholar educated in westernized Eastern European academia, it is difficult to transcend my anthropocentric bias. So I was rather thinking about history as a life teacher, as history as a magistra vitae. I was meditating on this lecture by Kimmerer. I returned later to my daily routine, reading news about the war in Ukraine. Nothing surprising. Images of destroyed homes, trees broken and uprooted, wandering dogs looking for their lost human friends, burning wheat fields, dead bodies on the streets, mass graves, forensic teams exhuming swollen and not fully decomposed human bodies, crying women raped in front of their children, hundreds of thousands of refugees searching for safe shelter. War as usual. Just another confirmation of the 19th century German philosopher Hegel's famous saying, which was here already cited twice. And I began to wonder whether we are at all ready to recognize history as a teacher. That history speaks to us louder and louder over these last decades, using various languages and means of communication. Viruses, bombs, algorithms, to name but a few, yet we are not quite ready to hear it. Perhaps we are not attentive enough, or perhaps it is not longer history that we should learn from about the past. A teacher comes when you are ready. The phrase, "a teacher comes when you are ready," does not mean that we are not looking to learn from history or that we are passively waiting for history to teach us. The phrase manifests a whole process of learning, thinking, and exploring various ways of knowing, experiencing, and researching the past. Learning from history means recognizing the limits of history as a specific approach to the past. I was wondering that perhaps we need to step out of history for a while in order to address our current problems. Perhaps answers that we are receiving from history are not enough, or they even limit our understanding of events and processes. As Dipesh Chakrabarty reminds us, there are pasts that resist historicization. As Dipesh argues, in calling attention to the limits of historicizing, the subaltern past help us to distance ourselves from the imperious instincts of the discipline, the idea that everything can be historicized or that one should always historicize. Thus, perhaps the ahistoricity of history-resistant pasts help us to reduce certain forms of absolutizing the past and opens an alternative to history as a discipline that incorporates different Western and even non-human perceptions of changes, reasoning, and sensing. As the historian of the American West, Richard White, points out, history is not only the only way of using the past. Historians recognize alternative ways of using the past in order to historicize them, domesticate them, and make them part of history itself. Whereas historians propose a kind of alternative history and show that indigenous and subaltern pasts wait to be somehow transformed and incorporated by history, I would like to consider the possibility of studying this past in order to create an alternative to history. The potential resides not only in subaltern history or in indigenous knowledges, but also in such flourishing subfields of history as animal history, plant history, new environmental history, new history of things, post-secular history, post-humanist history, sonic history, sensory history, big and deep history, in all these fields that experiment with non-anthropocentric, non-European, and non-secular approaches. I am aware that for us, historians from Europe, it is difficult to swallow heavy criticism of history as a kind of colonial enterprise that has contributed to and continues to legitimate various forms of violence and exploitation and reinscribes barriers between nations and cultures. It is difficult to accept that history is understood as an ideology of the Western worldview and belongs to the darker side of Western modernity, as Argentinian sociologist Walter Mignolo would say. It is difficult for me as a historian from East Central Europe, burdened with all this heavy baggage of totalitarian regimes, the Holocaust, the communist atrocities, to venture harsh criticism of anthropocentrism, especially now when I see so much human suffering behind the border. But as a critical scholar, I am also aware that the Western worldview is nothing but a point of view. As Morgan Lovu, an anthropologist from the University of Zululand in South Africa, reminds us, I have to accept that what Europeans cherish as civilization and progress for non-Europeans, especially indigenous groups, translates into genocides, ecocides, and epistemicides. Researching new tendencies and emerging fields in the humanities and social sciences, I have observed a paradigm shift that began in 2001. I have observed how it questions and dismantles the basic institutional foundations of history as the scholarly discipline that were laid in the 19th century already, namely anthropocentrism, Eurocentrism, historicism, scientism, and secularism. Today, the possibility that over 250 years of tradition of the historical discipline, as we know it, might be coming to end seems controversial, as does the recognition that we are bearing witness on a global scale to the emergence of approaches to the past that will incorporate and adopt only certain elements of history. History understood as a particular approach to the past that was born of the Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian cultures. A teacher comes when you are ready. History has no survival value. It multiplies conflicts rather than pacifies them. In the times of persistent and permanent crisis, however, history might play a role of a limited experienced teacher. It is important to explore the potentiality of history for studying and supporting human adaptive capabilities. By studying the human condition and limited experiences in times of wars, ecological disasters, terrorism, and forced migrations, history might become a form of knowledge capable of demonstrating various strategies of survival and concrete successful preparedness techniques. History might thus come to be treated as a form of soft power, not in the propaganda sense, but as a part of the emergency humanities that have to help to develop processes of resilience and adaptation stimulated from the bottom up. A teacher comes when you are ready. In indigenous teaching, there is what is known as 4 R's rule, which is based on principles of relations, respect, reciprocity, and responsibility. These principles serve as a code of conduct and as an ethical guide in cross-cultural teaching and learning. They suggest ways of becoming more responsive to different knowledges and ways of knowing, and more open to learning from them. Sami scholar Rauna Koukanen understands responsibility as an ability to respond to the world beyond oneself, as well as a willingness to recognize its existence. Feminist scholars such as Donna Haraway, Vinciane Defray, and Karen Barat approach the notion of responsibility as responsibility in a similar way. Responsibility is an ethical and epistemic virtue that has to be cultivated. One has to be able to respond. I reflect on the problem of bearing the consequences of my responses to current challenges, on my responsibility and responsibility as an intellectual, as a historian, scholar, and a teacher. But I also think about the social responsibility of universities, historical associations, and organizations. What is current corporate, historical, and social responsibility of CISH as a world organization of historians and of CISH commissions? How it is its accountability and ability to respond to contemporary challenges manifested? Has its structure and mission been able to handle these pressures? As Toni Morrison, a Nobel Prize laureate in literature, says, freedom is choosing your responsibility. It's not having responsibilities. It's choosing the one you want. And I have become to wonder, are we ready to make proper choices regarding our responsibilities? A teacher comes when you are ready. One of our Western elders, Hayden White, taught about the practical past versus the historical past created by historians. White was critical of the historical profession. As he argued, historians could not tell you how to deal with your present situations or solve your current practical problems. Thus, I have become to wonder, perhaps we indeed should consider indigenizing the future and abandon the idea of learning from history to instead focus on learning from the practical past. These ideas lead us toward history understood as an applied science that privileges such fields as local history, oral history, and public history, as well as particular methods such as place-based research, participatory research, and action research. Perhaps we should indeed be more attentive to indigenous scholars who stress that knowledges of the past sit in places. And if we want to address big picture questions, we should include not only various local traditional knowledges, but also various other than human entities that participate in knowledge building. Perhaps we should relearn how to learn from animals, plants, rivers, and mountains, how to respect them and treat them as gifts. Following the Arab-American writer and ethnobiologist Gary Upham, Kimmerer argues that we need restoration or restore action to tell a different story about the world and our relationship to place. In the meantime, however, while I'm comfortably here reflecting on history, women, men, and children are being killed in Ukraine. A teacher comes when you are ready. Each of us is a teacher, and we should be ready, as a phrase attributed to Mahatma Gandhi states, to be the change that you wish to see in the world. For now, I better get ready to pass on knowledge that we learned from survivors' testimonies and war memoirs, how to adapt, how to fight, how to hunt for food, how to prepare a shelter, how to provide medical first aid, and above all, how to stay human. Thank you.
So we have plenty of thoughts, plenty of reflections, but now the time has come to relax a little bit and hear some music.
That's right, thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, please. Dear ladies and gentlemen, Poznań is one of Poland's most important choral art centers with a big tradition, with a very rich tradition. So I have the pleasure to invite you to the concert of Adam Mickiewicz University Chamber Choir run by Professor Krzysztof Szydzisz. It will be a mini concert, so don't be afraid. I wouldn't be exaggerating to say it's one of the best university choirs in Poland. It's composed mainly of the Adam Mickiewicz University students, graduates, and teachers. It often takes the audience by surprise with its new project. It can be Jewish music, sailor song, Astor Piazzolla tango, gypsy song, Spanish carols. The Hilliard Ensemble, Paco Peña, Susan Moninger, Jürgen Müller, Sinfonia Varsovia. These are just a few names of great artists and groups with whom the choir has had the pleasure to cooperate. The choir has also released several records, and the last one is the Jubilee edition. If you are the enthusiasts of choral music, you can have a possibility to buy it downstairs after this event. Since 1998, AMU Choir has been the organizer of the International Festival of Choirs, which take place in Poznań every 2 years. In May, it was held the 15th edition of this festival. It promotes academic culture in the field of musical arts and creates a space for an artistic exchange. Choir has its unique sound thanks to the work with the conductor, who is the choir master, musicologist, specialist in voice production, speech therapist, and cultural manager. He currently works at the Academy of Music in Bydgoszcz as professor and head of the Department of Voice Production. Together with the Adam Mickiewicz University Choir, he has performed on 5 continents in 30 countries. Next week they will visit Macedonia. The singers of this choir say that the conductor is a very inspiring personality, and he used to say, if you have nothing to say in music, you should stop singing. That's why the choir has been singing for 30 years now. Today you will listen to the following pieces. Polish traditional, arranged by Marcin Wawruk, Leci głosie po rosie and Zbliża się Kupajło, solo Joanna Piech-Sławecka, Stanisław Chrust, Karolina Piesik, Kamila Tracewska-Mikołajczak. Another one, Polish traditional, arranged by Brygida Sawicka-Stępińska, Czyje to